For 40 years, he built his wife's company with his bare hands. But on the night of its biggest celebration, she stood on stage, looked him in the eyes, and thanked another man for everything he had done. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply walked out. 3 months later, the company began to collapse. And suddenly, everyone remembered his name. Daniel Hayes never liked attention. Even after 4 decades in the same company, the company he had helped build from nothing, he still preferred standing near the back of the room, just close enough to observe, far enough to be forgotten. That night was no different. The ballroom shimmered with polished glass, gold lighting, and the low hum of expensive conversations. Waiters moved like clockwork between clusters of executives, balancing trays of champagne that cost more than Daniel used to spend on groceries in a week. Laughter came easily here. Confident, practiced, almost rehearsed. Daniel stood near one of the tall windows, a half-finished drink in his hand. He wasn't drinking it for the taste, just something to hold, something to keep his hands from feeling as out of place as the rest of him. His suit was clean, pressed, but old. A quiet kind of old. The kind that didn't belong in rooms like this. Across the room, under the brightest lights, stood Victoria, his wife. Confident, elegant, untouchable. She moved effortlessly between investors, board members, and media guests, her smile sharp, her voice controlled, her presence commanding. Every gesture she made seemed intentional, calculated for impact. Daniel watched her the way he always had. Not with admiration. Not anymore. But with a kind of quiet distance he couldn't quite explain. There was a time when they stood side by side. Back when the company was just an idea scribbled on paper. Back when the office was a rented warehouse with flickering lights and second-hand equipment. Back when Victoria handled clients, and Daniel handled everything else. He had designed the systems from the ground up. Every machine, every workflow, every technical process that allowed the company to scale, it all passed through his hands at some point. Late nights, burned fingers, endless revisions, problems no one else even understood, let alone solved. He never complained, because back then, he believed something simple. That building it together was enough. That even if no one else saw it, she did. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his eyes drifting across the room again. That's when he noticed Adrian Cole, standing close to Victoria. Too close. Adrian laughed at something she said, placing a hand lightly on her arm. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be intentional. He wore confidence like a second skin. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect timing. The kind of man who didn't build things, but knew exactly how to stand in front of them. Daniel had seen men like him before. In meetings, in presentations, in moments where words seemed to matter more than substance. Adrian was the company's head of marketing. Officially, unofficially, he was something else. A shift, a signal. Daniel didn't need anyone to explain it to him. He had felt it long before tonight. The subtle changes. Victoria asking less about how things worked and more about how they looked. Her interest drifting from production floors to presentation slides, from solutions to perception. And Adrian fit perfectly into that world. Daniel lowered his gaze to his hands. Rough, scarred, still carrying the marks of years of work no one in this room would ever understand. He rubbed his thumb across an old burn line on his palm, a habit he had picked up without noticing. A small reminder of something real in a room full of things that weren't. For a brief moment, a thought crossed his mind. A quiet one. When did I become unnecessary? He didn't react to it. Didn't chase it. Just let it pass like everything else. Because that's what he had always done. Adapt. Adjust. Stay. Not for the company. Not even for the work. But for her. A sudden burst of applause snapped him out of his thoughts. Someone had stepped onto the stage. The event was beginning. Daniel straightened slightly, placing his untouched drink on a nearby table. Around him, conversations softened, attention shifting toward the front of the room. Victoria would be speaking soon. He knew that. He had known for weeks. And despite everything, despite the distance, despite the changes, despite the quiet doubts he never allowed himself to fully confront, there was still a small part of him that felt something familiar. Not pride. Something quieter. Something more fragile. Expectation. Not for recognition. He didn't need applause. Didn't need a spotlight. But maybe, just maybe, a moment. A single acknowledgement. A look. A sentence. Something that said, I remember. Daniel lifted his eyes toward the stage. And waited. Adrian Cole hadn't always been part of the picture. At least, not in the beginning. Daniel could still remember the first time Victoria mentioned him. It had been a passing comment over dinner, something about bringing in fresh perspective and modernizing the company's image. She said it casually, almost like it didn't matter. At the time, Daniel hadn't thought much of it. The company had grown. That was inevitable. Growth meant new people, new ideas, new directions. He understood that better than anyone. He had built the systems that allowed it to happen. But Adrian wasn't just another hire. He was a shift in gravity. It started subtly. Meetings Daniel used to lead became meetings he was no longer invited to. Conversations about production timelines turned into discussions about branding strategies. Words like efficiency and durability were slowly replaced by positioning and market perception. At first, Daniel told himself it was temporary. A phase. Something the company needed to explore before returning to what actually mattered. But it didn't return. It drifted further. And so did Victoria. She began staying later at the office, but not with him. Her calendar filled with client dinners, networking events, media appearances. When she came home, she talked less about problems that needed solving and more about how the company was being seen. Daniel listened. He always listened. But he spoke less. Because somewhere along the way, he realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't asking for solutions anymore. She was asking for agreement. And Adrian always seemed to have the right answers. Daniel had seen it happen gradually, like erosion. Adrian would present ideas in meetings, slick, confident, easy to understand. He didn't go into details. He didn't need to. He painted outcomes, not processes. And people loved that. Victoria especially. Daniel remembered one meeting in particular. A major client had raised concerns about product durability, something serious, something that required immediate technical adjustments. Daniel had already begun drafting solutions, calculating what needed to change. Before he could speak, Adrian stepped in. He smiled, calm and controlled, and said, "We don't need to change the product. We need to change the narrative." The room went quiet for a second. Then people nodded. Victoria nodded. Daniel didn't. Because he knew the difference between solving a problem and hiding it. But he didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. Didn't push back. He just sat there, watching as the conversation moved on without him. That was the moment he first felt it clearly. Not anger. Not even frustration. Just displacement. Like a piece that no longer fit the structure it once held together. Back in the ballroom, Daniel's eyes followed Adrian again. The man moved easily through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, leaning in just enough to make every conversation feel personal. People responded to him instantly. He made them feel like they were part of something important. Daniel understood why. Adrian didn't build anything. He sold the idea that something had already been built. And in a room like this, that was enough. Victoria turned slightly, saying something to a group of investors. Adrian stood beside her, close enough to be seen as part of her presence. Not behind her, not supporting her. Beside her, equal. Daniel noticed the way she looked at him when he spoke. Attentive, engaged. There was a lightness in her expression Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. Not at home, not with him. A quiet pressure settled in his chest. He didn't name it, didn't allow himself to, because naming it would mean acknowledging something he wasn't ready to face. Instead, he focused on what he could understand. Patterns, behavior, shifts. Victoria had always valued control, structure, results. But somewhere along the way, control had changed form. It was no longer about how things worked. It was about how things appeared to work. And Adrian was perfect for that. Daniel glanced toward the stage again. Everything tonight was carefully orchestrated. The lighting, the speeches, the guest list. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a statement. And statements required a narrative. He exhaled slowly. A memory surfaced, uninvited. Years ago, in that old warehouse office, Victoria had stood in front of a broken machine, frustration written all over her face. Nothing was working. Deadlines were slipping. Investors were losing patience. Daniel had spent hours rebuilding that system from scratch. When it finally worked, she had looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Back then, it had been simple. True. Now, Daniel's eyes drifted back to Adrian, then to Victoria, then back to the stage. The applause was building again as more guests gathered their attention forward. The night was moving toward its centerpiece. And for the first time, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not fully formed, not yet clear, but undeniable. A quiet question. Not about the company, not about Adrian, but about himself. If everything I built can exist without me, was I ever truly part of it? He didn't answer it. He just stood there, waiting, watching, as the distance between him and everything he once held together became impossible to ignore. Victoria stepped onto the stage with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. The room adjusted to her instantly. Conversations faded. Glasses lowered. Attention shifted like a tide being pulled in one direction. The lights above softened, focusing just enough to make her the center of everything without making it feel forced. She didn't rush. Victoria never rushed. She took her place behind the podium, glanced briefly across the audience, and smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to signal control. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth, measured, practiced. A ripple of polite applause followed. Daniel stood where he was, near the back, his eyes fixed on her. He had heard that voice in 100 different contexts, at home, in meetings, in quiet conversations late at night when things were still simple. But this version of her voice, this one didn't belong to him. It belonged to the room. "To our partners, our investors, our incredible team," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Tonight isn't just a celebration of success. It's a reflection of vision, of evolution, of knowing when to grow and when to change." Another pause, another wave of approval. Daniel felt the words more than he analyzed them. Change. He had heard that word a lot recently. Victoria went on, speaking about the company's journey, the early struggles, the risks, the milestones. She told the story well. She always did. Clean, inspiring, carefully edited. Pieces were missing, but no one in the room would know that. No one except him. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly at his side, though his face remained calm. He wasn't waiting for recognition. He had told himself that already. But he was listening, carefully, because even if his name wasn't spoken, there were things that couldn't be erased. Or at least, that's what he believed. "And as we look back," Victoria said, her tone shifting slightly, "it's important to recognize the people who didn't just contribute to our growth, but redefined what we could become." Daniel's chest stilled. Something in the phrasing caught him. Not the words themselves. The direction. He leaned forward just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Victoria turned her body, not toward the back of the room where Daniel stood, but toward the front rows, toward the people who mattered now. "There was a point," she continued, "when we had to make a choice. Stay where we were, or step into something bigger, something more competitive, more visible." A few heads nodded in agreement. Investors, board members, people who understood visibility as currency. "And that kind of transformation," Victoria said, her voice warming, "doesn't come from routine. It doesn't come from doing things the same way we always have." Daniel felt it then, not the words, the absence of something inside them, a quiet emptiness where something used to exist. "It comes from vision," she said, "from understanding how the world sees you, and having the courage to shape that perception." Applause began again, stronger this time. Daniel didn't move. His eyes didn't leave her, because now, he knew where this was going. Victoria smiled slightly, letting the applause settle before continuing. "And for that," she said, "there's one person I want to recognize tonight." The room leaned in. Expectation sharpened. Daniel's breath slowed. Not hopeful, not exactly, but present, completely present. Victoria stepped away from the podium slightly, her gaze locking onto someone in the front. Someone who challenged us to think differently, to move faster, to position ourselves not just as a company that works, but as a company that leads. A subtle shift ran through the crowd. People were already turning their heads, following her gaze. Daniel didn't need to follow. He already knew. And most importantly, Victoria added, her voice carrying just enough emotion to feel real. Someone who understood that success isn't just built in the background, it's presented to the world. There it was. Clear, deliberate, final. Daniel felt something inside him settle. Not break, not shatter, just settle, like a weight finally finding the ground after being held too long. Victoria lifted her hand slightly, gesturing toward the front row. "Adrian," she said. The name landed cleanly in the air. "Would you stand, please?" The room responded instantly. Applause erupted, loud, enthusiastic, genuine. Adrian stood smoothly, as if he had expected it. Of course he had. He adjusted his jacket with a small, practiced motion, offering a humble smile that didn't quite hide his satisfaction. People around him clapped harder. Some even stood. Victoria looked at him, not briefly, not professionally, but with a kind of open acknowledgement that didn't need explanation. This company, she continued, raising her voice slightly over the applause, would not be where it is today without your insight, your strategy, and your leadership. Leadership. The word echoed louder than the applause. Daniel didn't react outwardly, but inside, something quiet disappeared. Not anger, not pride, just the last expectation he hadn't realized he was still holding on to. Victoria didn't look toward the back of the room. She didn't look for him, not even once. Daniel exhaled slowly. His shoulders relaxed, not in defeat, but in something closer to clarity. Around him, people were still clapping, still celebrating, still believing the version of the story they had just been given. Daniel lowered his gaze for a brief moment, then lifted it again. Steady, calm, resolved, and without making a sound, he began to move. The applause followed Adrian like a wave. Loud, sustained, almost celebratory in a way that went beyond simple recognition. People weren't just clapping for a man. They were clapping for what he represented. Confidence, image, direction, everything the company had become. Daniel walked through it. Not against it. Not in defiance. Just through it. No one stopped him. At first, no one even noticed. Why would they? He wasn't part of the moment. Not anymore. His steps were steady, unhurried, the soft sound of his shoes disappearing beneath the noise of approval. He didn't look back at the stage. Didn't look at Adrian. Didn't look at Victoria. There was nothing left to confirm. He had already understood. Halfway to the exit, a few people turned, more out of instinct than recognition. A man leaving during a standing ovation always drew a glance. But when they saw his expression, or rather, the lack of one, they looked away just as quickly. Because there was nothing to engage with. No anger. No embarrassment. No visible reaction at all. Just quiet absence. Daniel reached the large glass doors at the back of the ballroom. For a brief second, he paused, not out of hesitation, but awareness. Behind him, the applause continued. Stronger, even. Victoria's voice rose again, continuing the speech, building on the narrative she had just sealed into place. A company shaped by vision, led by those who knew how to present it. Daniel pushed the door open. The sound shifted instantly, from warmth and applause, to silence and cool air. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit, neutral, real. He stepped out and let the door close behind him. The applause didn't follow. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe fully. Not shallow, not controlled, just breathe. His chest rose slowly, then fell. Again and again. There was no dramatic reaction waiting on the other side. No surge of anger. No overwhelming grief. Just clarity. Simple. Undeniable. It's over. Not the company. Not the work. Just his place in it. Daniel adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, automatic movement. His hands were steady. His posture unchanged. If anything, he felt lighter. Not relieved, but unburdened. Like something he had been holding for years had finally slipped from his grasp. And instead of reaching to catch it, he let it fall. A faint echo of laughter slipped through the closed doors behind him. Muffled, distant, belonging to a world he was no longer part of. Daniel turned toward the exit at the end of the corridor. Each step forward felt intentional, not reactionary, not emotional. A decision unfolding in real time. As he reached the building's main entrance, the night air greeted him. Cool, quiet, untouched by the performance inside. The city lights stretched outward, indifferent, steady, real. He stepped outside. The contrast was immediate. No music, no applause, no expectations. Just the low hum of traffic and the distant glow of streetlights reflecting off glass and pavement. Daniel stopped at the top of the steps. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking out, not searching for anything, just observing. 40 years. He let the number settle in his mind. 40 years of building, fixing, solving, standing behind something he believed in. And for what? The question came quietly. Not bitter, not accusing, just honest. He didn't answer it, because the answer didn't matter anymore. A car passed on the street below, headlights cutting briefly across his face before disappearing into the distance. Daniel exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. Several unread messages, most from colleagues, a few from unknown numbers. Congratulations. Celebrations. Fragments of a night he had already left behind. He didn't open them. Instead, his thumb hovered for a second, then moved with quiet certainty. He opened his email, scrolled, selected a blank message. 2. Human Resources. Subject, Resignation. He stared at the empty space for a moment, not searching for the right words, just confirming the decision already made. Then he typed, simple, direct, no explanation, no emotion, just the truth. When he finished, he read it once, not to change anything, but to make sure it felt final. It did. Daniel pressed send. The message disappeared instantly. No sound, no confirmation, just gone. He lowered the phone, and for the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for him to fix. No system to maintain, no problem to solve, no expectation to meet. Just space. Wide, uncertain, but his. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket, turned, and walked down the steps into the night. This time, he didn't look back. The drive home was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. The kind that pressed in from all sides, filling every corner of the car until even the sound of the engine felt distant, like it belonged to something else. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes steady on the road ahead. Streetlights passed in slow intervals, casting brief shadows across his face before disappearing behind him. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't check his phone. There was nothing left to respond to. For years, his evenings had followed a pattern: calls, updates, last-minute problems that needed solving before morning. Something always broke. Something always required his attention. Tonight, nothing did. The absence of it was almost unfamiliar. He stopped at a red light. The glow reflected faintly on the windshield, stretching across the empty passenger seat beside him. For a moment, his eyes drifted there, out of habit more than intention. Victoria used to sit there, back when they still left the office together, back when conversations filled the space between them. Now, it was just leather and silence. The light turned green. Daniel drove on. When he reached the house, everything looked exactly the same. The same front porch, the same dim light by the door, the same quiet neighborhood that had never cared what kind of company he worked for or how successful it had become. To them, he was just Daniel. And tonight, that felt more real than anything else. He stepped inside. The air was still, unchanged. There was no sign that anything had shifted, no indication that a decision had just been made that would alter the rest of his life. Daniel closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, his hand still resting on the handle, waiting, not for something to happen, but for something to feel different. It didn't, so he let go. The kitchen light flicked on with a soft click. Daniel walked in, placing his keys on the counter in the same spot he always did. The routine was automatic, muscle memory built over decades. He poured himself a glass of water, took a sip, set it down. Every movement was familiar, predictable, grounded, and yet, there was a space inside it now, a gap where something used to sit. He leaned lightly against the counter, his gaze drifting across the room. On the far wall, a small shelf held a few framed photos. Old ones, before the company grew, before everything became structured. Daniel walked over slowly, picked one up. It was from years ago, a warehouse in the background, tools scattered, equipment half-assembled. Victoria standing beside him, her arm loosely around his back, both of them younger, tired, but smiling. Not for anyone else, just for themselves. Daniel studied the image, the details, the expressions, the simplicity of it. Then he set it back down exactly where it had been. His phone buzzed. The sound cut through the quiet like something foreign. Daniel glanced at it, but didn't reach immediately. It buzzed again, persistent. Finally, he picked it up. Victoria. Her name sat on the screen. For a second, he just looked at it. Not surprised, not hesitant, just aware. He knew what this was. Not an apology. Not yet. This would be reaction, control, damage management. He let it ring once more, then answered. He didn't speak first. Daniel, what was that? Victoria's voice came through sharp, controlled, but underneath it, something tighter, something strained. He didn't respond immediately. Let the silence sit. You walked out, she continued, in the middle of the speech, in front of everyone. Daniel's grip on the phone remained steady. I left, he said simply. That's not the same thing, she snapped. Do you have any idea how that looked? He almost smiled. Not out of amusement. Out of recognition. There it was. Appearance. Always appearance. I think I do, he replied calmly. No, you don't, Victoria said quickly. You made it seem like there was a problem. Like something was wrong. Daniel looked toward the dark window, his reflection faintly staring back at him. There is, he said. A pause. Short. Tense. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. Daniel exhaled quietly. You thanked him, he said. Another pause. Longer this time. And Victoria replied, her tone shifting, defensive now. And you didn't thank me. The words landed without force. But they didn't need it. On the other end of the line, Victoria let out a small, sharp breath. This is what this is about, she said. Recognition? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not in frustration. Just in understanding. No, he said. Then what? She pressed. Daniel opened his eyes again, his gaze steady. You said the company was built on vision, he continued. Not execution. That's not what I meant. It is what you said. Silence. This time, heavier. Victoria spoke again, slower now. You're taking this out of context. Daniel shook his head slightly, though she couldn't see it. I'm not taking it at all, he said. Another pause. Then, sharper. You embarrassed me, Daniel. There it was. Clear. Unfiltered. Daniel let the words settle. Then answered. You erased me, he said. No anger. No raised voice. Just truth. And for the first time since the call began, Victoria had no immediate response. Victoria didn't speak for a few seconds. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because, for once, the usual responses didn't come easily. Daniel could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, controlled, but uneven. He had known her long enough to recognize that shift. It wasn't vulnerability. It was recalculation. You're overreacting, she said finally, her voice lower now, more measured. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. You don't understand how these things work. Daniel didn't interrupt. You think this is about who fixed what machine 20 years ago, she continued. It's not. It's about positioning. About growth. About keeping the company relevant. Daniel leaned back slightly against the counter, his eyes drifting again to the reflection in the dark window. I understand more than you think, he said. No, you don't, Victoria replied quickly. Because if you did, you wouldn't have walked out like that. You would have stayed. You would have supported the direction we're moving in. We, Daniel repeated quietly. Yes, we, she said. This is still your company too, Daniel. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The words hung there. Was supposed to be. Daniel let out a slow breath. I sent my resignation, he said. Silence. This time, not brief. Not controlled. A full stop. You did what? Victoria's voice came back sharper, the composure cracking at the edges. I resigned, Daniel repeated. You're serious? She asked. Yes. Another pause, but this one felt different. Not calculated. Not strategic. Unprepared. You can't just do that, she said. Not like this. I just did. That's not how this works. Victoria pushed. You don't walk away overnight. There are processes, transitions, responsibilities. I handled my responsibilities, Daniel said calmly. For 40 years. Her breath hitched slightly. That's not the point, she said. The company depends on you. There are systems only you understand. If you leave like this, you're putting everything at risk. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to his hands. Rough. Steady. Still. For the first time, he said, that's not my problem. The words weren't cold. They were unfamiliar. Even to him. Victoria didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had changed again, less sharp, more urgent. Daniel, listen to me, she said. This isn't about pride. We can fix this. If you felt overlooked, fine, we'll address it. We can make it right. Daniel almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it sounded. Make what right, he asked. The recognition, she replied quickly. Your role. Your contributions. If that's what you need, we can formalize it. Adjust your position. Give you a title that reflects your importance. I don't need a title. Then what do you need? She asked, frustration slipping through. Daniel paused. Not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud made it real. Nothing, he said. That answer caught her off guard. What does that even mean? Victoria asked. It means I'm done, Daniel replied. With what? She demanded. With trying to fit into something that doesn't need me anymore. That's not true, she said quickly. You're exaggerating. Daniel shook his head slightly. I watched you tonight, he said. Not just what you said. What you believe. Victoria didn't interrupt. You don't value what I do anymore, he continued. Not really. You value what he represents. That's not fair. It's accurate. Her tone hardened again. Adrian brings something the company needs, she said. Something you never cared about. Daniel nodded slightly. That's exactly it, he said. And what is that supposed to mean? She challenged. He knows how to make things look right, Daniel said. I know how to make them work. Silence. And right now, he added, you've decided which one matters more. Victoria exhaled sharply. You're reducing this to something simple because that's how you see the world, she said. But it's more complex than that. Daniel didn't argue. Because she was right. It was more complex. But the outcome wasn't. I'm not asking you to agree with me, he said. I'm just telling you where I stand. And where exactly is that? She asked. Daniel looked around the quiet kitchen. At the stillness. At the absence of noise, pressure, expectation. Somewhere else, he said. The line went quiet again. This time longer than before. When Victoria spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. Daniel, you're making a mistake. He considered that. Not defensively. Not emotionally. Just honestly. Maybe, he said. But it's mine to make. Another pause. Then, softer. You're really going to walk away from everything we built? Daniel's eyes drifted once more to the photo on the shelf. The one from years ago. The one where everything still made sense. He held that image for a moment. Then let it go. I already did, he said. And before she could respond, he ended the call. The next morning didn't feel dramatic. No sudden realization. No lingering tension from the night before. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles naturally when something long overdue has finally happened. Daniel woke up at the same time he always did. 6:10 a.m. No alarm needed. His body had memorized the rhythm years ago. Early starts, long days, problems waiting to be solved before anyone else even noticed them. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the usual wait to arrive. The checklist, the pressure, the sense that something, somewhere, was already going wrong. But it didn't come. There were no messages waiting for him to respond. No urgent calls. No unresolved systems hanging over his head. Just silence. Real silence. Daniel sat up slowly, placing his feet on the floor. The house felt different this morning. Not because anything had changed physically, but because nothing was waiting for him inside it. He walked into the kitchen, turned on the coffee machine, and stood there as it began its quiet routine. The low hum, the slow drip, it was a sound he had heard thousands of times. But today, it didn't feel like a pause between responsibilities. It felt like the start of something undefined. He poured a cup, took a sip, and leaned against the counter. No rush. No clock. No reason to hurry. For the first time in decades, the day didn't already belong to someone else. By 8 a.m., he was outside. Not in a suit. Not in a car heading toward the office. Just walking. No destination. Just moving. The neighborhood was awake in its own quiet way. People heading to work, cars passing, small routines unfolding. No one paid him any special attention. And that felt right. Daniel walked past a small hardware store on the corner. It had been there for years. He had passed it hundreds of times without ever going in. Today he stopped. Not because he needed anything. Just because he could. Inside, the smell hit him instantly. Wood, metal, oil. Real materials. Not polished surfaces or presentation slides. He moved slowly through the aisles, running his fingers along tools, picking up items without any specific purpose. A man behind the counter nodded at him. Looking for something? He asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not really, he replied. And for once, that answer was completely true. By late morning, Daniel found himself at a small park not far from his house. He sat on a worn wooden bench, coffee in hand, watching people pass. A man walking his dog. A couple arguing quietly. A kid struggling to ride a bike without training wheels. Life. Unfiltered. Unstructured. Daniel leaned back slightly, letting the sun settle against his face. His mind wasn't racing. Wasn't analyzing. Wasn't fixing. Just observing. And then, without warning, a thought surfaced. What now? It wasn't heavy. Not overwhelming. Just open. 40 years of direction had ended in a single email. Now there was space. And space required choice. Daniel wasn't afraid of that. But he wasn't rushing into it either. For the first time in a long time. He didn't have to. Around noon, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. 3 missed calls. All from the company. Different departments. Different numbers. He didn't answer. Another message came in. Short. Urgent. Asterisk. We need you to clarify system protocols. Production line is down. Asterisk. Daniel read it once. Then locked his phone. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because it was no longer his responsibility. He sat there for a few more minutes, letting that realization settle deeper. The company was already feeling it. The absence. The gap. The part of the structure that no one had fully understood until it wasn't there anymore. Daniel stood up slowly, placing the empty coffee cup in a nearby trash bin. As he turned to leave, he noticed something across the street. An old workshop. Small. Faded sign. Windows dusty but intact. He had seen it before. Never paid attention. Today he stopped. Looked at it longer than necessary. There was nothing special about it. No sign of opportunity. No clear reason to care. And yet, something about it felt familiar. Unfinished. Daniel took a step closer. Then another. Not committing. Just exploring. The door was locked. A small for lease sign hung crookedly in the window. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, studying the space beyond the glass. Empty, but full of possibility. Not corporate. Not polished. Not dependent on anyone else's approval. Just space. Real space. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not making a decision. Not yet. But for the first time since the night before, he wasn't thinking about what he had left behind. He was thinking about what he could build. And that thought, quiet, steady, and entirely his, stayed with him as he turned and walked away. The days that followed didn't feel like a break. They felt like a reset. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a gradual shift, like a machine that had been running nonstop for years finally powering down, one system at a time. Daniel didn't rush to fill the space. He let it stay empty. At first, he woke up without alarms. Ate when he was hungry. Left the house without a fixed plan. It wasn't freedom in the way most people imagined. No grand trips. No sudden reinvention. Just simplicity. One morning, he found himself back at the hardware store. Not out of curiosity this time. Purpose. He bought a few basic tools. Nothing expensive, nothing unnecessary. A new set of clamps. Replacement blades. Materials he hadn't touched in years but still understood instinctively. The man at the counter looked at him again. Working on something? He asked. Daniel paused for a second, then nodded. Yeah, he said. I think I am. By the end of that week, the old workshop across the street wasn't just something he passed by anymore. He had the key. The place smelled like dust and time when he first stepped inside. The air was stale. The floor uneven. The walls marked with years of neglect. Most people would have seen a dead space. Daniel saw structure. Potential. Work. He rolled up his sleeves. Not out of necessity, but out of instinct. The first few hours were quiet. Sweeping. Clearing. Opening windows. Letting light back into corners that hadn't seen it in years. No deadlines. No expectations. No one waiting on the outcome. Just process. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Meanwhile, across the city, the company didn't adjust as smoothly. At first, it was small things. Delays in production. Minor inconsistencies in output. Things that could be explained away. Temporary. Fixable. Adrian handled it the way he handled everything. Messaging. He reassured clients. Reframed issues. Positioned setbacks as transitions. And for a while, it worked. Because perception, when managed well enough, can buy time. But not solutions. The real problems started to surface in the second week. A core system failed. Not visibly. Not all at once. But deep within the infrastructure, where only someone like Daniel would have known exactly what to look for. The production line slowed. Then stalled. Engineers tried to troubleshoot. But the system wasn't documented the way they expected. Because Daniel had never built things for manuals. He built them to work. Years of layered adjustments. Custom fixes. Quiet optimizations that only made sense to the person who created them. Now, no one could fully trace them. Meetings were called. Emergency reviews. Blame shifted in careful, controlled ways. But beneath all of it, one thing became clear. Something fundamental was missing. Back in the workshop, Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and stepped back from the workbench. A small project sat in front of him. Nothing complex. Just a piece of restored equipment. Clean, functional, solid. He turned it on. It worked instantly. No hesitation. No adjustment needed. Daniel nodded slightly. Not proud, just satisfied, because it did what it was supposed to do. That was enough. His phone buzzed again. This time he checked it. A message, not from a department, from someone higher up. Short, direct, asterisk, we need to talk. Urgent, asterisk. Daniel read it, then locked the screen, set the phone down, and went back to work. By the third week, the company's issues were no longer internal. Clients started noticing. One major partner reported a failure in delivered systems. Another delayed a contract renewal. Then one more, and one more. Small cracks, becoming visible. Adrian increased communication. More meetings, more reassurance, more language, but no resolution. Because the problem wasn't external. It wasn't perception. It was foundation. Victoria saw it. At first, she resisted the thought, pushed it aside, trusted that the team would stabilize, that the structure they had built was strong enough to hold. But every report told a different story. Delays, losses, confusion, and one recurring detail in every breakdown. No one knew exactly how things were supposed to work. Not fully, not completely, not the way he did. Back in the workshop, the sun was beginning to set. Light filtered through the open windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel stood near the entrance, looking at the space. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was real. Every corner of it, every piece of progress, every small improvement. It belonged to him, not a board, not a narrative, not an image, just him. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The street was quiet, familiar, grounded. Across the city, things were beginning to fall apart. But here, everything made sense. And for the first time in years, that was exactly where he chose to be. By the fourth week, the problems could no longer be contained. They weren't internal glitches anymore. They were visible, public, expensive. It started with a failed delivery. A major client, one of the company's oldest partners, reported a critical malfunction in a newly deployed system. Not cosmetic, not minor, structural. The kind of failure that shouldn't happen. Not in a company of this scale. Not after 20 years of growth and refinement. The client demanded immediate answers. And for the first time in years, no one had them. The emergency meeting was called within the hour. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her expression controlled. But the tension in the room was undeniable. Screens lit up with reports. Engineers spoke in fragments. Partial explanations. Incomplete diagnostics. Nothing definitive. We need a root cause, Victoria said sharply. Not speculation. Silence followed. Then one of the senior engineers cleared his throat. We're trying to trace the system logic, he said carefully. But it's not mapped the way we expected. What does that mean? Victoria asked. It means, he hesitated, the architecture isn't standardized. There are custom layers. Adjustments that don't follow documented protocols. Another pause. And no one understands them? She pressed. The engineer glanced around the room. No one spoke. That silence answered her. Adrian leaned forward, breaking the tension. Let's not overcomplicate this, he said smoothly. This is a temporary disruption. We manage the client, reassure them, and buy time for the team to resolve it internally. Victoria didn't look at him immediately, because for once, that approach wasn't enough. They've already paused their contract, she said. That shifted the room. They what? Adrian asked, the first crack of real concern slipping through. They're reviewing all current agreements, Victoria continued. And they've requested a full technical audit. Silence again, heavier this time, because everyone in that room understood what that meant. Exposure. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. One failure turned into three into five, each one different on the surface, but connected underneath. Systems that no longer communicated properly. Processes that broke under pressure. Fixes that worked temporarily, then failed again. It wasn't chaos. It was something worse. A slow, systematic unraveling. Adrian increased visibility. More calls. More presentations. More carefully constructed explanations. We're evolving, he told clients. Transition always comes with temporary instability. Some believed him. At first. But results didn't follow. And belief has a limit when performance disappears. Inside the company, the tone shifted. Less confidence. More urgency. Teams worked longer hours, chasing problems they didn't fully understand. And in every discussion, one name surfaced, quietly at first, then more openly. Daniel Hayes. Victoria heard it, ignored it, then heard it again, and again, until it wasn't avoidable anymore. One afternoon, she stood alone in her office, staring at a series of reports spread across her desk. Failure points, breakdowns, delays, and one consistent pattern. Every critical system traced back to him. Not documented, not replaceable, just him. Her jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but realization. A memory surfaced, uninvited. Daniel standing in a production room years ago, explaining something no one else could follow. Calm, precise, certain. She had trusted that certainty, relied on it, built around it, and then she had dismissed it, replaced it with something easier to present. A knock on the door pulled her back. Come in. Adrian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked composed, as always, but not as effortless. We need to control the narrative, he said immediately. This is getting ahead of us. Victoria didn't respond. She was still looking at the reports. Victoria, he continued, more insistent now. If we don't manage this properly, it could damage long-term positioning. We need a statement. A clear message. She finally looked up. At this point, she said slowly, we don't have a message. Adrian frowned. We always have a message. Not when we don't have a solution. That landed harder than she intended. Because it wasn't just about the company. It was about him. About everything she had chosen to prioritize. Adrian shifted slightly. This is fixable, he said. We just need time. Victoria held his gaze for a moment, then asked, how much time? He didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time, he didn't know. That night, Victoria stayed in her office long after everyone else had left. The building was quiet. Still, she sat alone, surrounded by screens filled with problems that no presentation could solve. Her eyes drifted again to the reports, to the patterns, to the truth she had been avoiding. The company wasn't failing because of bad messaging. It was failing because the foundation had been removed, and she had let it happen. Across the city, Daniel turned off the lights in his workshop. The space was quiet again, ordered, complete for the day. He stepped outside, locking the door behind him. No urgency, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of work done right. He didn't check his phone, didn't need to, because whatever was happening back there was no longer his responsibility. And for the first time, the system he had left behind was learning exactly what that meant. The turning point didn't come all at once. It never does. It came in fragments. Small confirmations stacking on top of each other until denial was no longer possible. Victoria sat alone in the conference room, long after the last meeting had ended. The screens in front of her were still lit. Charts, reports, timelines, but she wasn't reading them anymore. She was staring past them, through them, at something much simpler. A pattern she could no longer ignore. Every failure, every delay, every unresolved issue, they all pointed to the same absence. Daniel. She leaned back slowly, pressing her fingers against her temple. For weeks, she had approached this like a leadership problem, a coordination issue, a communication breakdown, something that could be fixed with the right structure, the right messaging, the right pressure applied in the right places. But this wasn't that. This wasn't something that needed to be managed. It was something that had been removed. And now, everything built on top of it was shifting. A file sat open in front of her, one she hadn't looked at in years. Daniel's old system logs, handwritten notes scanned into digital archives, annotations no one else had bothered to study. At the time, they had seemed unnecessary, too detailed, too technical. Now, they were the only map left. Victoria leaned forward, scrolling slowly, line by line, adjustment by adjustment, each note precise, purposeful, built on understanding, not assumption. And suddenly, she saw it. Not just what he had done, but how much. The company hadn't just grown because of strategy. It had functioned because of him. Every system Adrian talked about, every position the company held, every success she had presented to the world, had been supported by something Daniel built quietly in the background, something no one else had ever fully replaced. The door opened. Adrian stepped in again, this time without knocking. His composure was still there, but thinner now. We need to talk, he said. Victoria didn't look up immediately. About what? She asked. You know what, he replied. This situation, we're losing control of it. Victoria closed the file slowly, then lifted her eyes to him. Control was never the problem, she said. Adrian frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, she continued, We don't understand what we're trying to fix. That's not true, he said quickly. We know exactly what the issue is: execution gaps, misalignment between departments. No, she cut in. The word was quiet, but final. Adrian stopped. For a moment, the room held still. Victoria stood up slowly, walking around the table. Execution didn't fail, she said. Execution disappeared. He stared at her, not fully following. Not yet. You think this is about communication, she continued. Or structure. Or messaging. Because it is, Adrian insisted. That's how companies scale. That's how they adapt. That's how they present, she corrected. The distinction landed harder than expected. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. You're overcomplicating this, he said. We've handled worse situations before. Victoria shook her head. No, she said. We haven't. A pause. Then she added. Because before, we had someone who knew how everything actually worked. The silence that followed was different. Sharper. More dangerous. Adrian's expression shifted. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just uncertain. For the first time. You're saying this is about Daniel? He asked. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Because the answer was already there. Everywhere. Later that night, Victoria sat alone in her office again. But this time, she wasn't looking at reports. She was looking at a single message. An email. Short. Simple. Final. Daniel's resignation. She read it again. Not because it was long, but because of what it didn't say. No anger. No explanation. No attempt to justify. Just done. Her hand tightened slightly around the edge of the desk. A memory surfaced. Daniel standing beside her years ago, explaining a system she barely understood, but trusted completely. You don't need to know every detail, he had said. Just know it'll hold. And it had. For years. Until she stopped asking how it held at all. Victoria stood up abruptly. The decision came fast. Not fully thought through. Not perfectly planned. But clear. She reached for her coat. Her phone. Her keys. Not as the CEO. Not as the one in control. But as someone who finally understood what she had lost. Across the city, Daniel was closing up the workshop. The day had been steady. Productive. Real. He wiped down the workbench, turned off the lights, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. Same routine. Same calm. No urgency. Until his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Victoria. He didn't answer immediately. Just looked at the name. Considering. Not emotionally. Just deciding. The phone rang once more. Then again. Daniel exhaled quietly. And this time, he picked it up. Daniel. Her voice came through. Different. Not sharp. Not controlled. Just direct. I need to see you. A pause. Daniel looked out at the empty street. At the quiet. At the life he had already started building without her. Why, he asked. On the other end. For the first time, Victoria didn't have a prepared answer. Because this wasn't about control anymore. It was about something much harder to say. And she knew it. Daniel didn't answer her question right away. He let the silence sit between them. Not as resistance. Not as punishment. Just space. I need to see you. Her words echoed faintly through the phone, but they didn't carry the same weight they once did. Not authority. Not expectation. Just urgency. Real, unfiltered urgency. Daniel looked down the street, hands resting loosely at his sides. The workshop door behind him was locked. The lights were off. The day was done. For once, he wasn't in the middle of anything. He had time to choose. Where, he asked. A brief pause. Then, your place, Victoria said. I'm already on my way. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in irritation, just awareness. She was still moving fast. Still assuming momentum would carry her through. It used to work. Take your time, he said calmly. I'm not going anywhere. He ended the call before she could respond. 20 minutes later, headlights cut across the front of his house. Daniel was already inside. The lights were on, but nothing else had changed. No attempt to prepare. No effort to control the environment. Just the same quiet space he had returned to the night before. A knock came at the door. Sharp. Immediate. Daniel walked over, opened it without hesitation. Victoria stood there. But not the version the world knew. Her hair slightly out of place. Her expression stripped of polish. No audience. No performance. Just her. And for the first time in a long time. She looked uncertain. Can I come in? She asked. Daniel stepped aside without a word. She entered quickly, glancing around the house as if trying to place herself in it again. Nothing had changed. And somehow, that made everything feel different. Daniel closed the door behind her. Say what you came to say, he said. No hostility. No warmth. Just direct. Victoria turned toward him, taking a breath. But whatever she had prepared didn't come out the way she expected. They're pulling out, she said instead. Daniel didn't react. The clients, she clarified. Contracts are being suspended. Audits are underway. If this continues, she stopped herself. She didn't need to finish. Daniel already understood. It's happening faster than we thought, she added, quieter now. Daniel leaned lightly against the wall, arms relaxed. And he asked. Victoria blinked, as if she hadn't expected that response. And, we need to stabilize it, she said. We need to fix the systems before it spreads further. Daniel held her gaze. You don't have the systems, he said. The words weren't harsh, just accurate. Victoria exhaled slowly. No, she admitted. That alone was new. Daniel said nothing, letting her continue. I've reviewed everything, she went on. The reports, the logs, your notes. A slight pause. I didn't realize how much of it depended on you. Daniel didn't respond. Because that wasn't new information, just newly acknowledged. Victoria stepped closer. Not aggressively, not confidently, just closer. I made a mistake, she said. The words felt unfamiliar in the room. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were rare. Daniel studied her face, looking for something. Not sincerity, not apology, something deeper. Understanding. You didn't make a mistake, he said. Victoria frowned slightly. Yes, I did. Daniel shook his head once. You made a choice. The distinction landed. Clear. Unavoidable. Victoria didn't argue, because she knew he was right. I chose wrong, she said quietly. Daniel let that sit. Didn't soften it. Didn't correct it. Because this wasn't about making her feel better. It was about truth. The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was heavy, weighted with everything neither of them had said over the years. Victoria broke it first. I need your help. There it was. Simple, direct, unfiltered. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked past her into the kitchen, picked up a glass, poured water, took a slow sip. Not to avoid the question. To think. Really think. For the first time, this wasn't about reacting. It was about choosing. He turned back toward her. You don't need my help, he said. Victoria stared at him. Yes, I do. No, Daniel replied calmly. You need what I built. The difference mattered. And you don't have it anymore. Her expression tightened. Then help me rebuild it. Daniel shook his head slightly. It doesn't work like that. Why not? She asked, frustration slipping in. You built it once, you can do it again. Daniel held her gaze. Longer this time. You still don't understand, he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Victoria's voice dropped. Then make me understand. A long pause. Daniel stepped closer, not aggressive, not emotional. Just steady. You didn't lose a system, he said. You lost the person who held it together. Silence. Deep. Uncomfortable. Real. Victoria's eyes flickered slightly. Because this time, she felt it. Not intellectually. Not strategically. But fully. So what happens now? She asked quietly. Daniel looked at her. At everything she represented. At everything they had built. And everything that had already ended. You figure it out, he said. Victoria's breath caught. That's it. Daniel didn't hesitate. That's what I did, he replied. The answer landed harder than anything else he had said. Because it wasn't rejection. It was reality. And for the first time, she had to face it alone. Victoria didn't leave right away. She stood there for a moment after Daniel's words settled, as if waiting, hoping, maybe, that he would say something else. Something softer. Something that gave her a way out. He didn't. Because there wasn't one. Not anymore. I see, she said finally, though it was clear she was still trying to catch up to what that meant. Daniel didn't respond. There was nothing left to clarify. She nodded once, more to herself than to him, then turned and walked toward the door. Her movements were slower now, less certain. At the threshold, she paused. For a second, it looked like she might turn back. She didn't. The door opened, then closed. And just like that, she was gone. The house returned to silence. Not the heavy kind from before. Something lighter. Resolved. Daniel stood where he was for a moment, then walked back into the kitchen and set the empty glass in the sink. The routine felt the same. But he wasn't. Not anymore. The next morning, the company faced its worst day yet. The audit results came in. Brutal. Clear. Unforgiving. System inconsistencies, structural weaknesses, undocumented dependencies. What had once been a seamless operation now looked fragile under scrutiny. Clients didn't wait. 2 major contracts were officially terminated. Another suspended indefinitely. The market reacted fast. Confidence dropped. And for the first time in its history, the company was no longer seen as stable. Victoria stood in the boardroom as the numbers were presented. No speeches, no framing, no narrative to soften the impact. Just reality. Raw. Unavoidable. Adrian sat across from her, unusually quiet. His usual confidence had nowhere to go. Because there was nothing left to position. Only consequences. What's the recovery plan? One board member asked. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time, she didn't have one. Not a real one. Days passed. Then weeks. The company didn't collapse overnight. But it changed. Rapidly. Departments were restructured. Projects were halted. Budgets cut. Adrian stayed, for a while. Tried to manage what he could. But without results, even perception loses power. Eventually, he stepped back. Quietly. No announcement. No recognition. Just gone. And Victoria stayed. Because she had no choice. For the first time in her career, she wasn't leading growth. She was managing loss. Fixing what could be fixed. Letting go of what couldn't. And slowly. Learning. Not from strategy. Not from advisors. But from absence. Across the city, Daniel's life moved in a different direction. The workshop was no longer empty. The dust was gone. The tools were organized. Projects filled the space, small at first, then larger, more complex. People started to notice. Not investors. Not executives. Just regular people. Neighbors. Local businesses. Someone needed something fixed. Someone else needed something built. Word spread. Quietly. Naturally. The way real things do. One afternoon, Daniel stood at his workbench, adjusting a final piece on a custom-built system. He tested it once. Then again. It worked. Clean. Reliable. Exactly as intended. He nodded to himself, wiping his hands. Satisfied. Not because it was impressive, but because it was right. A soft knock came at the open workshop door. Daniel looked up. Victoria stood there. Not in a suit. Not in control. Just present. She didn't step inside immediately. Is this a bad time? She asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. No. She walked in slowly, looking around the space. Taking it in. This is what you've been doing, she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. Yes. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just real. Victoria glanced at the workbench. At the details. The precision. The quiet discipline in every piece. I understand now, she said. Daniel didn't respond right away. Because understanding wasn't something you could confirm with words. It showed. Over time. In choices. In actions. In ways I didn't before, she added. That was closer. Daniel met her eyes. Good, he said. She hesitated slightly. Then. The company is still struggling, she admitted. But it's stabilizing. Daniel nodded once. He wasn't surprised. Struggle forces clarity. Eventually. I'm not here to ask you to come back, she said. That mattered. More than anything else she could have said. I know, Daniel replied. Another pause. Then she stepped back slightly. I just wanted to say, I was wrong. Daniel studied her for a moment. Not judging. Not forgiving. Just seeing. Then he nodded. Okay. No drama. No resolution speech. Just acceptance. Victoria turned to leave. But this time, there was no unfinished tension. No expectation. Just closure. At the door, she paused. You built something real, she said. Daniel glanced around the workshop. Then back at her. I always did. She gave a small nod. Then walked away. Daniel stood there for a moment after she left. Then turned back to the workbench. Picked up his tools. And continued. Not because he had to. Not because anyone was watching. But because this, finally, was his. And this time, he wasn't invisible anymore.